Good morning, everyone. Happy Labor Day. And it's great to see you all. For those who celebrate Labor Day, I think we all do. It's fantastic. Welcome to this fantastic and exciting side event that's focusing on the Nairobi Work Program. My name is Musonda Mumba. I work for UN Environment based in Nairobi, and I'll be facilitating and moderating the conversations at this session. I want to mention that we will need to leave this room at 14:45 because there's another session happening at 3. So I really would like to propose that our discussions are concentrated and really focused and directed. So welcome. So to start with, I really would like to welcome all the panel members. Thank you so much for coming and for making it today. And as our topic suggests, closing knowledge gaps on human settlements and adaptation, a way forward. For those of you who were here in November of last year, 2017, we had a fantastic and really exciting and to some extent very charged conversation around human settlements and adaptation. Fairly recently in the news, I'm sure you all heard, Cape Town, a very beautiful city, some of you might even have visited this city, was edging on what is called day zero. I'm sure you all know what day zero means, right? For all of us who had showers this morning, some people are not having showers in Cape Town, and that is a reality. So when we talk about our settlements and when we talk about cities, so we will be hearing from our presenters on this panel to really look at the conversation around these very places we call home and where we live today. So without further ado, and in the interest of time, I really would like to call upon Mr. Santana, who is the SABSTER rapporteur and will be giving us an intervention. Over to you, Monsieur. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this side event of the Nairobi Work Program on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation to climate change. In line with the mandate from SABSTER 44, 46, and 47, the Nairobi Work Program serves as a link between parties and non-party stakeholders to share knowledge and foster collaborations. Events such as this, convened on the margin of SABSTER, provides an opportunity to engage NWP partners and experts in a meaningful discussion together with policymakers with the aims of turning knowledge to action on the ground that will, 1, close adaptation knowledge gaps, and 2, inform the formulation and the implementation of adaptation plans and actions. In addition, the feedback collected here will serve to inform future activity under NWP in a way that supports its potential role in the implementation of Paris Agreement. Following the guidance from SABSTER, this side event continues a year-long engagement with parties, Nairobi Program partner organizations, and other relevant experts on the topic of adaptation and human settlement. Activities began in April 2017 with a summary report on existing global and regional initiatives on human settlement and adaptation. The report was followed by a call for submission, the key findings of which were reviewed with experts at pre-COP technical dialogue and during the 11th Focal Point Forum on Human Settlement and Adaptation at COP23. This input have informed the collaborative development of synthesis paper being presented today. Our discussion this afternoon will build on previous exchange with the aims to identify concrete next steps. I invite partners and parties to take this opportunity to share this idea and to propose actions to close knowledge gaps related to human settlement and adaptation for decision makers and planners at local and national level including developer of national adaptation plans. We are joined by several NWP partners and experts, including from UN Habitat, ICLAI, Local Government for Sustainability, and the University of Southern Denmark, who have supported this discussion over the past year and have already taken steps to address knowledge needs identified. I would like to thank them and all of NWP partners for their contribution to the process and look forward to hearing your views on how to best align our cumulative effort under the Nairobi program. Relevant bodies include the Adaptation Committee and Least Developed Country Expert Group, and under the Paris Agreement to scale up adaptation actions. As a rapporteur of Substar, I will use this insight gathered in this session to inform the current review of Nairobi program with a view to enhance the relevance and effectiveness of its activity as a knowledge to action hub for climate resilience. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome back Mrs. Musonda Mumba to facilitate the event. Dr. Musonda Mumba is an ABA flagship coordinator at UN Environment. Her background is in wetland ecology, and she has spent the past decade working on ABA and environmental related works across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, including UN Environment and WWF International. More recently, she coordinated the German-funded ABA Mountain Project on Peru, Nepal, and Uganda, which was implemented jointly with UCN and UNDP. We have been fortunate to have Musonda with us throughout the discussion on human settlement and adaptation, and I shall now turn over to her to begin the section. Thank you all once again for being with us today, and wish you an inspiring and productive exchange. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that, and your very kind words. So he articulated briefly the conversations that we had last year at the Nairobi Work Program 11th Focal Point Forum. Now, the synthesis paper is going to be summarized in a presentation by my colleague and counterpart Laura Kavanagh from the UNFCCC Secretariat to really give us a little bit of an idea of what the key findings and the way forward, what has been suggested. Please, Laura, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll need a... So thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm here to give a brief overview of the synthesis report that we've prepared, and as you've heard, this is the result of a series of events and discussions over the past year. So in that sense, I'd like to be brief because many of you helped us produce this report, and we'd like to get to the discussions and the next steps. But for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, to put this in context, to talk about the problems and some of the gaps that we're looking to fill. So first of all, over these discussions over this past year that we've had with the technical dialogue and the focal point forum, we identified a various collection of problems here on what was actually hindering adaptation planning in human settlements. So these are outlined on the screen. They include poor access to quality data, lack of capacity and technical skills, financial constraints, nothing so surprising, but what we wanted to do was really target some of the direct questions on what specifically was needed next, and this is what our discussions will hopefully touch on today. So as we were mandated by Subsa 44 to explore a series of 4 questions, 4 areas of human settlements and adaptation, and to report back on what the gaps were, what the initiatives and resources were that were available, and put this in a paper for further discussion. So here we have In relation to the first question, which regarded assessing sensitivity and vulnerability to climate change, some of the key points really highlighting that the human settlements, and particularly in least developed countries, are particularly vulnerable to climate change. This is a finding of the IPCC as well. And you really need to, when working with human settlements, consider the local context and the various vulnerabilities of different groups within those cities and settlements as well, and have that different aggregated data available. A key point that's come out of these discussions again and again is that inclusive and participatory planning is very important to build that ownership so the interventions will be successful, and that there's numerous resources available to build on. So now it's maybe more of a question of helping to deliver those resources to the officials and practitioners that need support. In terms of the second question, we discussed integrating both short-term and long-term climate considerations into planning. And this is really helpful to have that long view so that we're avoiding maladaptation, and we're minimizing sort of along this adaptation continuum potential loss and damage in the future, and we're building on long-term capacity. So this involves some of the outcomes that came out of the discussions were that this involves developing a land use plan to manage expansion of our human activities and settlements. Also looking at green solutions, not just sort of conventional infrastructure, but also ecosystem-based adaptation solutions, and taking a regional integrated approach. So what works for one city isn't harming the next city or settlement downstream, for example. This is particularly relevant for themes such as food security. So what we've really found is that adaptation is also dynamic, it's ongoing, it's iterative. So you have to combine the short-term needs with that long-term view, because in the end, you really need to raise awareness and affect behavioral change. So trying to balance both of those parts. And finally, that risk settlement of communities should be a last resort, and we should be looking at other options such as upgrading instead. In terms of the role of national governments and linkages to the national adaptation plans, as we will hear a bit more, so I'll touch on this, it's important to integrate adaptation human settlements considerations into those national plans and consider different ways to facilitate multi-level governance approaches. The national governments really have a role to provide an enabling framework for cities and human settlements to develop and fund and enforce their adaptation actions. And they can also help facilitate mediators on the ground, researchers, local stakeholders that can also provide support. In terms of city-to-city partnerships, which we'll also hear more about, these have been viable to facilitate a shared learning process between cities and communities that face similar problems or that are trying out different solutions, for them to learn from each other and learn about the risks and the good practices that are already out there and understood. Again, here there are many networks and multi-stakeholder networks and city networks available, and these are available at the global level, regional, national level, and they also are there to provide specific sectoral work. So it's not a question of creating more necessarily, but building on the resources that are there to provide and enhance those local capacities. Another point that came out here is the importance of also capturing the impacts, understanding the impacts of climate change at that very local level, and the responses that are being taken to be able to feed this back in and improve that iterative process that I spoke about earlier. In terms of next steps, these were 3 key points that came out of our discussions at the 11th Focal Point Forum on potential ways forward, and we hope to get into this today. So first of all, it was sort of summarized that national governments and the international community are able to provide additional capacity strengthening of public sector staff and researchers, and to facilitate access to other actors and adaptation finance. In terms of the Secretariat, under the Nairobi Work Program, we were invited to convene an event such as this, and more going forward, we hope, to identify specific knowledge needs, to get more detail. With all these resources that we've now identified and with the broader knowledge gaps, how do we move forward? And so that's what the discussion will be about today, to help us serve as that bridge that will align the supply of knowledge from partners to the demand from our parties and national governments, specifically related to human settlements. And finally, our partner organizations and experts are invited to help us in that regard and share their expertise to put together some proposals and action pledges for closing these gaps and removing those barriers and problems that were identified at the beginning. just so you've seen it, we're going to have a discussion today, and one of the ways that we capture this is through our adaptation knowledge portal. So hopefully this will come back at the end, and this is where we will feed in some of the ideas that will come up today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much for that summary. So we now get to the meat and the nitty-gritties of the conversation. Robert Cahew comes from UN Habitat. He's the lead on climate change in UN Habitat based in Nairobi, like myself. And so, Robert, I would like to turn to you to make your presentation and intervention on focusing on really getting a better understanding on some of these adaptation gaps coming from an institution that actually does deal almost primarily around settlements. Over to you, Rob, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Musonda and Mr. Santana and fellow panelists and distinguished guests. I would like to talk about a topic that has been raised, integrating human settlements into national adaptation plans. First, talking about why address human settlements in national adaptation plans, what we've done to date in developing supplemental guidelines on this topic, and next steps and conclusions. First, why should national adaptation plans concern themselves with human settlements? Well, already the world is more than half urban, and by 2050, 2/3 of the world population is projected to live in cities, and climate-related hazards are affecting human settlements and in cities. And I think here particularly we have to note informal settlements, and it's no surprise to those of us in the room who have worked in cities in developing countries that informal settlements are almost always located in some of the most precarious sites that are exposed to risks of flooding and landslide and other environmental problems. So integrating human settlements into national adaptation plans is important. And when we during last year-long process of exploring this issue with the Nairobi Work Program, this did come out at the, as was mentioned, at the 11th Focal Point Forum last year as a gap, and that providing guidance on integrating human settlements into NAPS was identified as an outcome and would be a good practical way to distill some of the knowledge about how to build climate resilience in human settlements and provide it to those who are developing national adaptation plans. So, of course, there are the technical guidelines for the national adaptation plan process, but there is also, as we know, a series of supplementary guidelines, and we propose to work together with partners to develop supplementary guidelines on integrating human settlements into national adaptation plans. Our progress to date is we have begun to review national adaptation plans and have been looking at how they address human settlement components. And there's some promising practices in this area. First, though, we should mention when we talk about human settlements is not an individual sector. It's a geographic location where a number of sectors come together, and particularly sectors with a particular urban element are housing, transportation, solid waste management, building, and land use planning or urban planning is a way to integrate these various sectors in a concentrated territory that is a city or a human settlement. Promising practices that we've noticed is there are NAPs that do really pay attention to human settlements. In the Brazil NAP, there's a standalone chapter on climate change adaptation in cities. In the Sri Lanka National Adaptation Plan includes a sector action plan for human settlements and infrastructure. And the Burkina Faso National Adaptation Plan discusses urban planning and land use planning as ways to integrate these different key sectors and as ways to address human settlement vulnerabilities. Now, this is a review of some of the existing national adaptation plans, but we also, as part of consolidated knowledge, wanted to look at the processes for developing national adaptation plans, including this was a topic that colleagues explored several weeks ago at the NAP Expo in Egypt. And again, several promising practices were identified. In Egypt, the ministry has supported local climate action and analysis at the local level, which is more of a top-down approach, and that's complemented in some countries such as Mozambique by more of a bottom-up approach where the National Association of Municipalities has played an active role in promoting the replication of local adaptation planning and also to take lessons up to inform national plans and policies. So they're both top-down and bottom-up dynamics underway here. Nepal also is a promising practice where a city focal point is included in the National Committee for NAP Development. We also see the supplementary guidelines as a way to incorporate guidance coming from some of the major development agendas that have come out over the last couple of years. The New Urban Agenda, for example, which my colleague alluded to, talks about promoting the development of infrastructure that will reduce the risks and impacts of disasters, including the rehabilitation and upgrading of slums and informal settlements. And similarly, it calls for strengthening and retrofitting risky housing stock, including in informal settlements, to make it resilient to disasters. Here, some clear guidance to, as was mentioned by Laura, to try to rehabilitate and upgrade and only take relocation as a last measure. And that sort of guidance coming out of global agendas can be incorporated into guidelines for national adaptation planning. And national adaptation plans can be a way for countries to, in fact, start to implement some of their commitments under global agendas. We have a proposed way forward, including additional consultation, work with peer reviews, and with an aim to launch guidelines on including human settlements in national adaptation plans at COP24 at the end of the year. In conclusion, UN Habitat and partners working on this, we appreciate the interest of the LEG in these guidelines, and we please provide us with your guidance so that we can strengthen these and make these guidelines as useful as possible. We invite member states and other stakeholders to please share your experiences on integrating human settlements into national adaptation plans. We can feed this into the work. And we also welcome the guidance of UN climate change and the Nairobi work program on how we can best launch these guidelines at COP24. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you so much for that very interesting and very exciting presentations. For those who may not be aware, UN Habitat held one of the biggest meetings focused on the urban agenda, which is really, really critical for all of us. And I think you can contact him to get a lot more information or even find it online because it's very much connected to the conversation that we're having here. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Steve Gawler. Steve is coming all the way from Melbourne to present to us, and he's the Regional Director of the Oceania Secretariat of ICLE. And Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Musonda, and again, greetings to everyone here in the room, our distinguished guests, and thank you for this opportunity for a brief input. I do come from Australia, from Melbourne, but we're doing a lot of work now in the Pacific Islands, particularly the Southwest, and I wanted to anchor my comments today on our work in the islands. I thought we are down under in Australia, so I thought I'd do the presentation back to front. So I'm going to start with my conclusions, and then I'll proceed to an example and then finish with what ICLEI is trying to do about it. So closing the knowledge gap, challenges facing island settlements particularly. What are some of the challenges? Well, one of them is actually in many small island countries, there is not a really clear distinction between the roles of national government and local government and sometimes provincial governments. And so the way a lot of us think about what does a national government do, what does a mayor and a council do, doesn't apply. There's a lot of shared responsibilities. There are often shared staffing. In one of the cities we're working in, 80% of the city's staff are seconded from the national government. Secondly, who has responsibility for settlements? In most cases, I would say around the world, the governance structure for settlements is some form of local authority or at least subnational authority. But this needs to be clarified, and clearly when we're moving on to looking at informal settlements. So the second point I wanted to make, and it builds on what the previous speakers have said, is the need to formalise tenure in informal settlements, because if we are serious about helping to assist the residents of informal settlements to feel more secure and permanent so that they can plan and they can invest in their resilience with confidence, they need to have some guarantee of tenure. And often this is not the case. But equally, it's very difficult for a local government to provide support to informal settlements when there's no formal arrangements, when they really can't regulate things like building codes and hygiene and sanitation, when the residents or occupants are not making any contribution back towards the cost of providing services and therefore don't feel a sense of responsibility. So the importance of tenure is really key to a lot of this. Getting onto the knowledge gap, what is our thinking? And I was trying to come up with my own formula for what is knowledge. And I've decided, for me, knowledge is firstly, there is data, there is information. Secondly, I actually understand what it's saying to me. And thirdly, it's available. I feel a sense of ownership and I can access it. So the situation, particularly in small islands, is a great variability in the data that's available. There's often scarcity or patchy. Quite often a lot of very impressive work has been done for certain elements of the islands and for the settlements, but then there are huge gaps. And very often that data only becomes available through international efforts. It's beyond the capacity of local authorities, might be beyond the capacity of national governments. So the need to translate that data into something that's understandable and actionable at the city level is probably the key theme that I'm talking about today. And finally, and I guess this is a plug for ICLEI and some of the others in the room, local governments need partners to help them to interpret, to help them to sift through all the information, to prioritise, to plan, and then to start taking action. And we see intermediaries such as ICLEI are really critical and possibly missing in a lot of cases. So those are the key messages. So I could finish my presentation at this point, but I've got a little bit longer. So with your indulgence, an example from Honiara, which is the capital of the Solomon Islands, Southwest Pacific. And this is a study which was done by the UN Habitat. And one of the pieces of information they did was to map informal settlements. So 28% of the total population of Honiara lives in informal settlements, and that's covering 15% of the land area. Just like Bob's photos, we can see how precarious some of that housing is. So before ICLEI started working with Honiara, UN Habitat had already conducted a climate vulnerability assessment and then a much more comprehensive urban risk and climate adaptation plan called the HERCAP. So this was a very good example of the international agencies, international funding and the science community, because it was conducted by the University of Melbourne, producing fantastic information and mapping. And you can see an example there. This actually shows the vulnerability hotspots in terms of climate vulnerability, but it's overlaid on where are the informal settlements. You won't be able to see the detail, but trust me, there's a very high correlation between the most vulnerable spots and where the informal settlements are. Now that information was available, and then ICLEI came to town thanks to UN ISDR and started to help the city self-assess their readiness for disasters using the Sendai tools. And we were able to refer the city to this study. Now, what's really interesting is a lot of the people in the study, in the city, a lot of the city leaders only vaguely remembered the HERCAP. And that's my point. They were aware of it. They were probably involved in some consultations, not sure where the report was and certainly not sure how to use it. So that's where we were able to come in using a filter like disaster risk reduction, talking to the originators of the study and helping the city to see, okay, this is how we can use it. So our message to the international community at COP23 is that small islands have settlements, towns, cities, and those towns and cities typically have nearly all the range of challenges of any large city in the world. And we look through all of the parameters of waste, transport, health, housing, food supply, sustainable energy supply, etc. But this has been somewhat misunderstood at the international level, where urban agendas haven't necessarily coincided with small island agendas. So ICLEI, along with a partner group, the Global Islands Partnership, which actually picks up many of the agencies we've heard about today, WWF, UN Habitats, IUCN and many others. We've banded together and presented a concept last November here at COP23 called Frontline Cities and Islands. And it's to provide accelerated assistance for sustainable and resilient development for the most vulnerable island towns and cities. The key plank of this is city-to-island twinning, and that's what we're talking about, city-to-city exchange, south-south exchange, peer learning is a very powerful concept. And at the ICLEI Resilient Cities Congress last week, we had quite a big and very well-credentialed delegation from Fiji attended the Congress. They were hosted here by the City of Bonn, which is the very first partnership which has been born under the Frontline Initiative. And we saw immediate learning, sparking of many ideas, the city people from Fiji getting fantastic best practice from elsewhere around the world. And so there's a list here of some of the approaches that we're going to take, but it's very pertinent to today's session. So we highlight the special case of island settlements. We cultivate city-to-city and island-to-island learning. We help them to prioritise the projects that they need to work on. We test and share solutions. We help them with financing, innovative and traditional financing mechanisms, and developing a special pathway through the UNFCCC and other multilateral international donor systems. That takes us back to the start. It's the role of the friend, the partner, who can be side by side with the cities and help them to navigate this very confusing landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Steve, for that very interesting and exciting example there from a small island developing state. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Nicola, who's coming in from the University of Southern Denmark, to give us a presentation as well, really looking at, what will be your topic?
I read the title here, it's Science Policy Dialogue for Urban Climate Action.
Fantastic. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sundar. Thank you very much to the Secretariat for the kind invitation, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues. So basically, I would like today just to report the results on a number of events I chaired in the past few months, starting from these two. Starting from these two at the World Urban Forum. The first one was on sustainable urbanization, the Paris Agreement, and the second, community-based urban resilience, looking particularly at co-benefit and integrated action. These two side events has been setting the ground in order to organize another side event within the city's IPCC conference, which main objective was to start a dialogue in between practitioner, policymaker and academia to work together on human settlements in order to contribute in a clear way to the objective of the Paris Agreement. Within this specific side event, we were looking about a number of issues that I will introduce in a second, particularly vertical and horizontal integration of policy and actions. But I would like to make a little step backwards, because all these events and dialogues has been generated by the seminal report by UN Habitat that has been analyzing the urban content of national determined contribution that I have the privilege to lead author. And the results within it, as you can see, a significant number of countries are having urban content at different level. And most importantly for this conversation, I would like to outline that 58 countries are defining specific measures on urban adaptation, contrasting specific challenges regarding adaptation in cities within the indices. So these are the three questions that has been discussed in Edmonton during the Cities IPCC conference. The panel was composed by Representative the Honorable Minister Rigobert from Santa Lucia, representing national government, Secretariat of Environment of the City of Quito, representing local community. It's being co-organized in partnership with UN Habitat and with UNFCCC, or better say UN and Climate Change nowadays, and with members of academia that are part of the network that I'm coordinating. Three main aim. One, it's the horizontal integration of national policies, how to better integrate urban content national policies, passing from the Paris Agreement, Sendai Framework for Risk Reduction, Sustainable Development Goals, and importantly, the new urban agenda. The ability to integrate cross-sectorial action at subnational level, particularly local level, and the vertical integration, meaning how to harmonize national policies with local action, and how to reflect and how local action can actually contribute to both national terming contribution and national adaptation plans. Here we identified during the panel and the following discussion, identify 4 key challenges. First, how to foster cross-sectorial and multi-level, multi-scale approaches. This is related to point 3, meaning we have scarce resources, financial, human, particularly local level, particularly mid-sized and small-sized cities, and we do need to have integrated action. So how to define trade-off of integrated action and how to foster this horizontal integration that works both at national level and subnational level. Challenge 2, it's improve multi-level governance. This harmonization vertical that is spanning from the international policy arena, national policies, and spanning down to the very local level. How to strengthen access to finance, technology, and institutional capacity, and how to empower stakeholders in a systemic, integrated, and collaborative action. This, to give you an example, is that, for example, at local level, it's not quite enough to work with the city councils. We need to involve other kind of stakeholders, also because, particularly for adaptation, it's not just a matter of look at administrative boundaries of cities. We need to look at the biological region of the city. We need to work at multi-scale. Here I would like to focus, we develop 4 key recommendations to continue to work on in the future, but I will focus just on 2 today, the one highlighted in red. The first one, to continue the work on monitoring the urban content of NDCs. Now we have a baseline that need to be strengthened. We have much more data to analyze to create a complete baseline that can be used for future benchmarking, both for preliminary stock taking 2018 and this full stock taking 2020, and get very much included on the system for monitoring, reporting, and validation. The same analysis, as Robert was speaking about, it has been undertaken by our respective institution parallelly. Now we will try to harmonize it in order to undertake jointly, eventually, a full analysis of national adaptation plan for urban content, and all this in order to develop actionable guidelines and recommendation for both national and subnational actors. And this is regards very much the vertical integration part and the horizontal integration at national level. The last point is the creation of urban resilience observatories that should be actionable in order to strengthen horizontal integration on local level. We have been developing a first concept note on the full structure of these observatories, and now with UN Habitat, particularly City Resilience Profiling Program, we are jointly working in order to make this pilot and fully tested at local level in the months to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that. Okay, so I've just been reminded very quickly. So if you would like to receive some of these presentations, I'm sure you're all very interested in them. Please don't forget to send your registration to the email on the screen, which would be very, very useful. On that note, we come to a segment of the side event that is going to get you to stand up. So we're going to have two groups. One group will be here at the front. We've only got this room, I'm afraid. One group will be here at the front, and the next group will be here at the back. You can decide which group you want to be in. So the first group is really going to discuss, you've got about 20 minutes to have a good conversation. So the first group is really going to discuss what does the National Adaptation Plan, or what can the National Adaptation Plan, do effectively to integrate human settlements, and what does this integration actually look like? So we'll have one group. We're fortunate enough, I'd like to recognize Madame Meriel, who's coming from the government of Togo and is a member of the Least Developed Expert Group, the LEG, and is here, and she can talk a bit about the NAPs and the thoughts on that. Then the second group that will be at the back is going to be looking at what is needed to convert existing resources into more actionable knowledge for local and national officials. I think we've had some really fantastic discussions, and for a moment I was actually wishing I was you, Nicola, to really go to some of these meetings that string together these conversations. Urban Forum, UNFCCC, Sendai Framework, all these dynamics that are happening. I think now the world is beginning to converge. So we're very welcome. We've got 20 minutes. I shall ring the bell when you hear this. That means that the side groups are finished and we now have to come back to report back. So the first group will have a rapporteur and facilitator of the group. The second group, I'm not sure, perhaps the Secretariat can provide some guidance. We will also have a rapporteur and facilitator for that group. So if we can move, we've only got like a minute to decide which group we can go to, or less than a minute actually, so we can be very quick, and we have 20 minutes for discussions. Thank you.
So we'll take group 1 in the front, group 2 in the back. Sure. Which one? This one. When we will send this, maybe
you're going to be our reporter.
Yeah, coffee off.
I think Laura's just wrapping it up. Sure, maybe.
Or I can write, no, I can write.
Hello, thank you for your interest. It's a good chance to hear from you your thoughts about the integrated human settlements into national adaptation plans. Can you take 3 or 4 comments to start? Yes?
I'm sorry, which question are we dealing with?
Well,
The first question.
the first question, yeah. And please speak up so maybe introduce yourself and so everyone can hear. Okay, that's okay.
David?
Yeah. That is it. So the question was, if I could summarize, or the comment was about how different sectors and so different ministries are involved in urban development. Is that sort of it? That is an issue, and when it comes to for example, let's take an example. If a local government is doing work that contributes to an NDC, how do they report it? Do they report it through different ministries? Does each ministry need a mechanism to capture contributions from local governments to implementing NDCs? It's a headache, that sort of thing. It's not resolved. Yeah. Well, the question was why we talk about human settlements, and it is because that includes smaller settlements than just cities. Cities we think of as large, but also human settlements includes towns and even villages and rural human settlements too. Yes, sir.
Okay, coming back to the, I'm Alpha Gallo from the Gambia.
Okay.
I'm also the partner point. So coming back to the first question,
Yeah.
we haven't yet done our NAP formulation, but I think a NAP that integrated human settlement is a NAP that is based on or has incorporated sectoral policies. Okay, sectoral policies, then we include policy on land use and settlement.
So, okay, very good. So you're from Gambia, and the comment is that a NAP should include the relevant sectoral policies. So which sectors in particular would you think of?
Well, the sector of agriculture is one. Then you have the local government plans and policies.
Yeah.
Then the sector of forestry. because that will determine new settlements as people would like to invest into new or to look into the new forest areas and then try to bring a new settlement. So the policy, to incorporate the policy, forestry policy also is a good sector. And the coastal management part. Transport. That is important, but in designing settlement, we care for transportation.
Okay, thank you. And I think some of your comments have to do with the national development plan, where should new settlements go? Like that.
Yeah, because I just replied to the question.
To the
Question what national
Thank you. Yes, that's right. To repeat the topic, what does a map that integrates human settlements look like? Madame, did you have your hand up?
I did, but
I thought
I can contribute. So my name is Beth Lavender. I'm from Canada, and I'm also a member of the LEG. I think two sort of reflections. I guess the first being that NAPS as country-driven kind of process that makes sense. And NAP will look different in each country that incorporates human settlements, but at the very least, because it's at the national level, it does need to incorporate policies and programs that can facilitate good adaptation in human settlement. And so it sort of depends on what the national jurisdiction is related to the subnational jurisdiction. So, for example, from Canada, we have on adaptation, we at the federal level, we can facilitate research that is hard for subnational governments. We can put in place legislation, or we have large infrastructure funding initiatives, and we can ensure that there's a climate lens put on those infrastructure investments. Anyway, it all relates to jurisdictions. I think that the federal, in the national level, there are things that can enable work to happen at the subnational level.
So the NAP should also include policies. It shouldn't just be large projects. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, it can include policy recommendations. Well, let's hear. We have limited time, so we have a couple other hands up. Yes, please.
So I'm from India, and all of these points are pretty relevant. But coming from a very country with such diverse situation, having a national adaptation plan, that needs to figure out somehow that the plan can actually cater to the entire length and breadth of the country with so many diverse issues and so many challenges.
Yeah, that's hard. How do you prioritize actions in that? That's a good question. We'll take other quick comments. We don't have too much time. Yes, and then a couple more. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Faye from Association. I studied forestry before in Korea. And I have very little knowledge about mental health and biological health. Loneliness and having mental and biological health.
All right, the health dimension is important. Oh, we have 10 minutes. Oh, we still do have time. Thank you for that. Okay. Yes, sir. That it should also address mental and physical health, biological health. Yeah. So, can we get this gentleman? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Christian. I work with the NAP Global Network and
The NAP
Global Network.
Okay, yes.
And so many of the countries that we're working with, I think it's just, sorry, the first point is just that the NAP document itself is only one stage of the process, and many of the countries that we're working with are really treating it as a process of moving from planning implementation to monitoring and evaluation. So in Ethiopia, PCs are doing regional consultations based on the framework or the NAP document they have, but I just NAP document as an endpoint.
Okay.
Whether it, even if it includes human settlements, also taking the NAP document back to the regions and communities so that they can continue to input how it is implemented, I guess.
Okay. Well, let me ask about that. You said it's not, so the comment was that the NAP is not an endpoint. Does that mean it can be revised, or that it should it have an indicator framework for monitoring, or what does that involve?
Absolutely. So the NAP document, the NAP process, NAP is 790, but it's meant to be very iterative as well as it's meant driven, so it's built into the process to have make course adjustments based on your monitoring and evaluation framework.
Okay.
And it should absolutely be responsive to what is actually working.
Okay.
So I think it's important to have human settlements and local governments input on what is working.
During the implementation phase. Okay. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I want to highlight the importance of for disaster risk reduction. I heard that there was a mentioning of green. The land use. But actually, we need to buy the landscape. What the effects are of loss of ecosystem. So you should look at a watershed level. Vice versa, actually, rural areas surrounding the city. For instance, water extraction, groundwater extraction for industry and housing has land subsidence. One of the essentials, number 5, is actually exactly on this.
Something that I want to the NAPs should have
Should have a very strong mandate.
forum the highest political.
That's yes. Okay. Very good. Very good. Yes.
Hi, I'm Davidato from Brazilian Cities, Italy. I think a NAP should absolutely have an aspect, a mandate of protecting cultural and natural heritage, because in my eyes, at least, that's a smart way to engage with local communities. Cultural and natural. Yes, but that's a smart way to engage with people in local communities, especially because in small settlements, it's not that easy to find huge monuments and huge relevant stuff, let's say. So people there might be more attached to small things, poor trees planted around, whatever. So that's something to consider.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Klaus Sadunski from Austria. What I feel would be a feature of a good national adaptation plan if it includes some already implemented examples of good examples where local communities were able to enhance their resilience. Okay. Because usually the barriers are within the community in order to implement action. And the good examples had to trigger action also in leisure.
Thank you. So the supplemental guidance should include some good practices to encourage.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Because we will always have front runners and those who wait and see.
Okay, good. I could picture that the guidance could have some
The champions
case study boxes. Sorry?
The champions that you to identify the champions who are ahead a little bit.
Thank you for that suggestion. Good. Other suggestions or comments? These very valuable contributions, and we will take them into this process of developing guidance on this topic. So this will all be well captured.
And you can stay where you are. We'll do the reports from where you are. Yeah, so just stay put. We'll come to you.
Thank Thank you. We can actually have the whole day to discuss this very exciting and really important topic because we all live in cities pretty much. So my proposal is that we start with group one and the rapporteur can make a quick presentation, 2 to 3 minutes if possible, to just summarize the conversations that you've had. We're going to capture all of this and share it with everyone. And then after you've done your presentation, we're going to ask Steve's group to then make a presentation from Steve Gala. So please, over to you.
From the Secretariat, I'm just going to give a plug that we're going to look for leads on who might be willing to take these up and sort of pledges moving forward. So if you think about that and let us know, we'll be in touch. Thanks, Nicola.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert, for the facilitation, and thanks to all of you for your input. We tried to, there's been an interesting discussion with many different points. We tried to summarize it and trying to be as much as adherent to what you said as possible. So first point is to facilitate the reporting of what cities are doing to our both NDCs and NAPs, also being able to quantify the contribution that cities and human settlements are doing to our NDC and NAPs. Second point is to incorporate specific sectorial policies. Here there's a list of it. It can be also coastal management, transport, and then there is a number of policies that are related to land use and land use change, quite like the change from agriculture to urban or to forest use to urban. Third one, it's regarding governance, legislation, and normatives that are different in each national context. So it's a problem to understand the governance system specific to every nation and to act within that. Canada was speaking about the support that they're giving widely to research and infrastructure and giving specific normative to that can facilitate the action at human settlement level. Number 4, it's include policy recommendation, not only projects. So to give clear policy mandate and not only try to develop programs and projects. Number 5, it's to define priorities, priority actions that are aware of the specific local context and the diversity of local human settlement context within the same country. Then number 6, it's health issues, both mental and biological, and importance of health issues regarding adaptation. Number 7, it's to look at NAP as processes, not an endpoint, and use it also to frame continuous collaboration and have NAP framed as a self-adaptive, dynamically adaptive process that can also be adapted and changed in time. Number 8, it's ecosystem services, looking at the cities within their biological region and look also at the rural-urban interface, also in terms of trade-offs. Number 9, it's to define a high-level policy mandate, including support for action and implementation given to the human settlement. Number 10, it's to be aware of natural, cultural, and tangible heritage to be considered and to capitalize the knowledge of local communities, for example, in developing specific action for human settlements. Number 11, include example of local communities resilient, successful examples, and also the difference in between front runners as inspiration and followers that are in different phases of their development. Number 12, focus on human settlement specific challenges and specific vulnerability. And number 13, specific finance mechanism and instruments shall be also mandated within national adaptation plans in order to favor implementation at local level. And finally, number 14, to get fully on board the local community and their endorsement for any adaptation action. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, and well done to the group for your thoughts and your minds. Steve, over to you, please.
Thank you. Our question was what is needed to convert existing resources into more actionable knowledge for local and national officials, and I'm actually going to hand over to my friend. We've broken the flip chart into what's the needed, but then Laura says you have to have a couple of actions or pledges, so we've got them on that side.
Our work was not so detailed as the work of the first group. However, the question is how to influence the existing plans and policies. And we think that on a national level, it's good to join it with a high-level agenda on the government. It's a Sendai framework, SDGs, and through this to bring from top to down this through regulations, which can have a more high level of authority for local governments as well. So another issue is very important is to strengthen local governance with knowledge and with understanding of importance of their role as a service provider to their communities, that the risks for utilities that they are managing, it can be sewage, it can be water, it can be important income for these communities. As from Dominican Republic was mentioned, tourism is important and local governments are taking taxes from that. So they have to understand also the risk and to join these priority sectors and through this to empower the local government is important. And is important also when we are communicating as an expert community or donor community with local government to choose and recognize relevant roles and appropriate messages to transfer to the local government on different levels. Anchor on most. Yeah, this. And it's important also to support and to foster the dialogue between mayors, between local governments, because it is peer-to-peer exchange and it's good to support the pioneer municipalities who have good experience and to share this with their peers in other communities. So to make the community leaders to work as a one community, and in this case the messages can be more appropriately formulated and appropriately reach appropriate ears. And it's important also not to look for the risks which the communities are now facing, but to look also the risks which can come up as a water shortage or health issues or waterborne diseases and such type of things, which in any case have to be dealt by the local communities. So, and the actions that the formulation is what message we are giving to parties is that to support the dialogue with and between municipalities, and through this is important also to this linkage to Sendai framework, SDGs, and urban planning policies and all these things. It is good that the parties or national governments will join their efforts and improve the dialogue with municipalities and local governments. And with this is very important to strengthen these local administrations with knowledge, with open platform, open and easy digestible information about the risk, about the science, about the ways of dealing with different risks. And also there was a bit confusion in the group with this formulation, but we understood in this manner. So if I am wrong, you can change, you can give the more details. It's important also not to look only to the problem, but also to show the solutions, because with small steps, with a very good positive impact with these problem solutions can give courage for future actions. Yeah, good. No, no.
I want to add, problem solution is what you said was very, very correct. But what I would like to say is that it's worth the effort to look at the problem, because our tendency is to rush towards the solution, and it's very doubtful if we have the right problem solved. And if you look into the problem, you will see that many problems are much the same. And so it's a basis for sharing experiences and also for concerted action to move forward.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you to the group as well for your amazing minds and contributions. We have nearly 10 minutes before we close, but if there's anyone with a burning issue, if you were in the other group that you want to say something that you think might be missing there, or if you were in this group, the first one, you think there might be something. The lady over there, please introduce yourself. There's a mic coming your way.
Hi, my name is Adriana. I'm an intern at the Science and Research here at the Secretariat, and I have a science background. And some of these, what we do as scientists sometimes is go look for answers where they cannot be provided. And I wanted to propose the use of geographical information systems in gathering the information we cannot use in the construction of national adaptation plans.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we do have the website where you can, and also the email where you can actually send your thoughts. So we're going to capture all of these points together and really then sort of wrap everything up together for this outcome, correct? Great. So I'd like to invite Julio Cardona. So before Julio actually makes a presentation, I'd just like to really summarize the conversation because we're sort of coming to the end here. We heard from the presentations that were presented, which were really, really fantastic, starting with Robert from UN Habitat, who really articulated in terms of the role of what UN Habitat has done in building on what we've done last year at the Focal Point Forum. And I think for me, what was even more exciting was the fact that you actually did mention countries in terms of champions around NAT processes, Egypt, for example, in terms of promising elements, Nepal, looking at Mozambique. I mean, it's clearly something is happening in the countries where we all come from. And also building on the urban agenda, which I think is really, really critical. I was so very much intrigued by Steve's presentation because he started with a recommendation. And I think one thing that was really exciting for me and what was very interesting, something that was captured in your presentation was very much the issue of what's emerging from the groups, the role of the local government and also national government. Tenure is a really, it's a sore topic that actually needs to be discussed and sliced and articulated because you cannot build resilience in urban settlements without actually discussing, where people are sitting, where they're living, and also, amenities. And I think you raised the whole point of vulnerability and how it's closely correlated to this element of tenure. The gaps, the young lady from UNFCCC has actually just articulated my thoughts in terms of the science. So if we're going to actually visualize GIS, etc., in all of these elements, how is this information actually shared with the average person on the street? So the data, this is something that came up very clearly from your presentation, Steve. How is this actually sort of visualized, articulated, shared? But also you raised a very important point in terms of how information sometimes is limited, it's scattered, or it's just absent. But I must say, there's a lot of universities actually doing a lot of research on island states. Does this information come from the universities in the north, perhaps? This north-south sort of collaboration and element, which is actually very important. GLISPA, which is one of the best and I think very well demonstrated partnerships in terms of how it's worked.
Almost as good as ICLEI.
Indeed. In terms of how it's really consolidated the thinking and bringing together partnership organizations, experts, scientists, etc. Nicola, you really brought together the conversation rounder in terms of all of these big dialogues, Urban Forum, IPCC, all these really, really big conversations that are happening, but really also this element, the vertical horizontal dynamic that needs to happen. And I think this was already feeding into this discussion. How can we realistically and do sort of this whole integration happen? Finances, technology, capacity development. What does it actually look like in terms of a city setup? And I really liked your challenge, and you mentioned something in your presentation about the biology of a city. We actually always forget that these places are breathing spaces. The air we breathe in a city, the water we drink, how do we actually look at those ecosystem services that these cities are providing us, or even the surroundings outside of the cities that provide these resources? So I think in closing, before I close, I really would like to say thank you so much for your amazing thoughts and really your contributions to all of this work. I would like at this opportunity to welcome Julio Cordano, who's coming from the government of Chile, to really also summarize and just close this meeting, this side event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Musonda. Thank you very much, all of you, for such a great experience, really, because as you know, my day job basically is to be a party delegate, and I'm involved in negotiations, and it's actually so refreshing to come to a place where a conversation actually makes sense. So that's really encouraging, and I'm actually tempting to stay in this side of the table. So, but I guess my boss back in my capital will allow me, or I have to make up a very good excuse. I just wanted to say a few things, just to provide some very general remarks, because I think you have made a wonderful job summarizing the very rich discussions that I've been hearing throughout the side event. And I guess I'm biased in a way, because I come from a region of the world that has a very high level of urban population. Latin America has very high levels of people that live in cities. So I guess human settlements in my part of the region, it is very much a matter of managing cities in a way that are friendly to people, and that actually provide a space for people to realize their own lives and fulfill happy lives. And this is why in the case of Chile in particular, the National Adaptation Plan is a very broad document that is more like a conceptual framework, but underneath the National Adaptation Plan of Chile, there are many sectorial national adaptation plans, so specific for each sector. And one of the sectors that are already being covered is precisely about cities. And I think that follows a very nice example that was presented in one of the presentations about Brazil. I think that also it's a very interesting example of how to tackle that from a perspective of a Latin American country. And I guess one of the things that happens when you already have such a high level of urban population, and I think this is very common to everybody around the world, is how do you make sure that local authorities, and this was very much repeated around in the discussions in this event, how do you make sure that local communities and local governments actually have the power to interpret, to read, and to be effective in addressing the challenges that are presented by local communities and an ever-changing urban landscape. And for that point of view, I think I was thinking that decentralization is a process that every country is going through, and it is a very powerful adaptation tool. But at the same time, it can be a very dangerous adaptation tool. A decentralization process that is not done correctly can be a very difficult and very negative maladaptation process if it's not accompanied by other things, like, for example, capacity building for local communities, I think, and for local authorities. And at the same time, I think finance was mentioned at some point, but the means of implementation discussion, I think is multifaceted in a way. And I think if decentralization is not accompanied by capacity building and finance, understood as enabling environments for capacity building and in the local community, that can provide some reassurances that decentralization is not going to do any harm, but on the contrary, will provide very good examples and opportunities to actually adapt to climate change. We cannot leave local communities alone. Is decentralizing and giving more power to local communities and local governments. It doesn't mean that we just have to provide them with legal powers and then leave them alone. Central governments have a very important role as well, and precisely to connect the local reality with all those international frameworks that were mentioned before, like the New Urban Agenda and the UNFCCC process and many other processes. So I guess one last comment is that if you look closely at the concept of human settlement, you will see that there are basically two words there: human and settlement. Human, of course, speaks about precisely local communities, and that needs to be aligned with a very strong system of participation and transparency, and probably the principles of access rights to participation, justice, and information are very handy and very useful for achieving the human side of the equation. And also the settlements. I think settlements doesn't stop at the edge of the city or at the edge of the settlement. I think it's very important the point that cities sit in the context of ecosystems. And ecosystem services are absolutely vital for any city. So, so I guess it's a very complex challenge and balance between what is happening within the cities and settlements and the ecosystems that are either in the margins of the cities or further away, but provide very important services to the communities. So again, I'm very gladly, not surprised, but I'm very glad to be here hearing this, and I'm sure you will be sorry to hear that I will have to go back to negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for those fantastic closing remarks. On that note, I would like to thank you so very much for participating in these very exciting discussions and wishing you amazing and exciting participation in the coming days and obviously for next week as well. So have a very and fantastic afternoon. Thank you.